first-time visitor, and if not, welcome back. We love all of the regulars who come to the Searchlight series and also the new faces. I'm going to give a very quick introduction to Eastern State Penitentiary. The building was built on farmland outside of Philadelphia in the 1820s, has this distinctive architecture that was copied all over the world. There are hundreds of copies of this building, including prisons that are still in use today. And if you play the game Sim City and you tell the computer to put a simulated prison in your city, it looks like this. So the building's influence continues to this day. It was built for solitary confinement with the belief that people are inherently good and silence would encourage reflection. And so the building had about 85,000 men and women over the course of 142 consecutive years. It is the hardest thing about this building to convey the number of people, the number of stories, and the human lives that took place behind these walls. Today, by the way, even this room has been used for this purpose throughout the building's history before it was even an historic site. Today, most of our visitors take an audio tour of the building to explore its history. We also have artist installations like this one by Michelle Handelman about issues facing trans inmates in today's prison population, or Bill Cromar's piece about Guantanamo Bay inside of Eastern State. Jesse Crimes' beautiful mural that he created while incarcerated in federal prison, now exhibited here. In the last 5 years, we've really begun to focus all of our new programming on the relevance of this building to the United States today and what's happening in our criminal justice system today. We built a giant graph that shows the rate of incarceration over time, asking how our visitors might want to see it change. We built an exhibit about mass incarceration as well that we hope you'll come back and visit if you haven't seen it yet. That exhibit opens by comparing the number of people in prison per capita to the crime rate, which has gone up and down and is now basically where it was when we started this whole set of policies that led to this many people in prison. The crime rate is within 1% of where it was in 1970. So we finally made the conclusion that mass incarceration isn't working, and our exhibit is about what we could do next. I'm very happy to say that through all this programming that asks very difficult questions of our visitors, our attendance has continued to grow. We've had a 400% growth in our attendance in the last 10 years, 4 times the number of people. So Americans are ready to have this conversation, and thank you for joining us for part of the conversation here tonight. Looking ahead, we're working on a project now to commission animated films by artists who are currently incarcerated. We're going to be projecting them onto the front wall of the prison, and we are building a modern visitor center finally with toilets and bathrooms. Come back for that. Our real bathrooms. This is the Searchlight series. This series takes place on the first Tuesday night of every month. It's always 6 p.m. It's always free. It's always just an hour. Stop by, join us. It's always about contemporary issues. There's a survey on your chair. We really do read them. If you have thoughts about what kind of speakers you'd like to have in the future, please do let us know. Next month, we have our friends from I should have written this down, the National Alliance for Homicide Awareness, I believe. I think that's the the title is The Maze, the Entangled Journey of Families of Murder Victims through the Criminal Justice System. It's going to be a very powerful and very meaningful conversation next month. I'm going to turn it over to our friend Nancy Brennan to introduce tonight's speaker. I should have said we welcome you on behalf of Sally Elk, our president and CEO, and our amazing event teams who put together tonight's event. And I also should have said, let's turn off our cell phones. So I'll do it now if you do it. And some board members, Kathleen is back there in the back, some other board members around as well. Nancy Brennan's going to introduce our speaker. Nancy.
Thank you, Sean. Exciting times in Eastern State. I'm Nancy Brennan. All right. Welcome to Searchlight series, and forgive my voice. I'm Nancy Brennan, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Lauren-Brooke Eisen, our speaker tonight, who will give you a really rare view into private prisons and their impact on today's society. I am wearing eagle's boots, I want to point out. And metaphorically, I'm wearing 3 other hats. I am a board member of Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law. where our program and the justice program is focused on an analysis of criminal justice practices and their impact as a priority of one of our 5 issue areas. Second, I'm the youngest child of William Joseph Brennan Jr., Justice William Joseph Brennan Jr., whose 34 years on the United States Supreme Court, one of his real focus was bringing constitutional principles to the treatment of the accused and the incarcerated. He was very troubled by particularly the consequences of those who are not white and not well off. And last but absolutely not least, I was sometimes consultant to Sally and her fabulous team here at Eastern State Penitentiary and the extraordinary work that they do here. And I am a very proud member of Eastern State, and I trust many of you in the audience are as well, or soon will become one. Lauren-Brooke Eisen brings a record of distinguished service as a journalist and lawyer, policy expert, and author to the Brennan Center. She is senior counsel in the Brennan Center's justice program, where she focuses on improving criminal justice processes through legal reforms, specifically how the criminal justice system is funded. Prior to that, she was senior program associate at the Vera Institute for Justice and its Center on Sentencing and Corrections. She also served as assistant district attorney in New York City, where she served in the Appeals Bureau. Before entering law school, she worked as a beat reporter for a daily newspaper in Laredo, Texas, where she covered the criminal justice system. Her book, this book, Inside Private Prisons, I just finished it this week. It is a precise, balanced assessment of how we got into private, for-profit prisons and their place in mass incarceration and immigrant detention. And she'll be sharing some really eye-opening findings in her talk with you. And then we'll be taking some questions up until 7 o'clock. And that will be followed by a reception that I hope you'll stay for. As I read her book, I was upset with myself, honestly, for somehow missing how we slipped into, or slid into private prisons over the last 3 decades, both in the state and the federal systems. But as she points out, this is the time for the public to insist, at a minimum, that the prison industry provide more humane treatment, more programs in prisons, more reentry training, in return for our dollars as payment into their coffers. Change is ever present, and reform is possible, particularly when there is awareness. As James Baldwin wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. Will you join me in welcoming to the podium Lauren-Brooke Eisen?
That was a lovely introduction. Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'm thrilled that the parade is Thursday. We were really about how hectic it would be, but congratulations to Philadelphia. I live in New York City. And so I will speak about the book. How's this sound? Good? Great. And I'll do a little bit of readings from the book, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions because it's a pretty large crowd tonight, and I can tell by looking at you that a lot of people have questions, so I look forward to that conversation. So this book, Inside Prisons is a story about the intersection of profit and incarceration. And it grew out of my work at the Brennan Center for Justice, where I work in our justice program, and I've been looking at the incentives that perpetuate mass incarceration and increase prison populations. And we would have mass incarceration, and I've just seen this incredible exhibit about mass incarceration out of the yard here. We would have mass incarceration with or without the private prison industry. We have mass incarceration because the United States has had incredibly punitive criminal justice policies for decades. We send too many people to prison, and we keep them there for too long. But this book understands that, and this book explains that this is really an inquiry into how we have relied on the private prison industry since the mid-1980s to house an increasing number of individuals behind bars, and how we have allowed corporations to make incredible profits off of people behind bars. And it's also a human story. So I interviewed a lot of incarcerated individuals, their families, individuals who spend time in private prisons. And I also wanted to tell the story through their eyes. And this is a historical examination of our increasing reliance on private prisons, but it's also a human story told, hopefully, through these people's worldview. And people always say, well, where did they come from? What's the sort of origin of these modern corporations that manage prisons and jails and immigration detention centers? And these corporations really began in the mid-1980s. In 1985, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. Policymakers could not win elections at the state level and the federal level if they were seen as anything less than tough on crime. And our incarceration rate has started to increase. And by 1985, about 3/4 of states were under some sort of federal court order to reduce a prison population in at least one, if not many, prisons in its state. And Tennessee was one of those states. During the summer of 1985, there were riots at 4 prisons. These were covered by the media. Incarcerated individuals had been on TV. The breaking point that summer was incarcerated individuals in one of these prisons were asked to wear uniforms of stripes. And a fledgling company called Corrections Corporation of America, many people know of it as CCA. Today it's rebranded itself, it's now called CoreCivic. It made an unprecedented offer to the governor of Tennessee. And CCA said, look, you're doing a lousy job of running your prisons. You're under court order to reduce the population. Let us come in and manage your entire state prison system. And we'll do this if you pay us $250 million over a 99-year lease. Now again, this was an unprecedented offer at the time. And Governor Lamar Alexander's wife, Honey Alexander, was also an investor in the company, so he certainly examined the offer and thought about it. At the time, the state attorney general was vehemently against the offer, as were other policymakers in the state. And while all of this was happening, the Chicago Tribune sent a reporter there, and there's a quote from that Chicago Tribune story in 1985 that still gives me chills because it was so fresh here at the time. And it still speaks to the dilemma and the struggle and the debates about profit and incarceration over 4 decades. The quote was, there was considerable confusion last week in the halls of the Tennessee State Capitol building about whether the lobbyists for Corrections Corporation of America were cavalry coming to the rescue or profiteers coming to exploit. And I think that quote really illustrates the debates that we've had for so many years about what it means to rely on corporations to manage jails, prisons, and immigration detention centers. Is it legal delegate such a core governmental authority, even if it is legal, does that validate the industry? Does the industry save money? And even if it does, shouldn't incarceration be expensive anyway? Are the conditions of confinement different in private prisons versus public prisons? And those are the issues and the themes that this book really explores. And back to Tennessee, after some considerable debate, the state turned down Correction Corporation of America's unprecedented offer. But CCA and some of the other fledgling corporations that had started to think about managing jails and prisons were ecstatic. One of the high-level officials at CCA at the time, one of the founders, a man named Don Hero, said, "It forced everyone to take us seriously." The author ran on the full front page of the afternoon paper. He was referring to the New York Times. We were a national story. And governors, heads of corrections, at the federal level, officials started to take notice of these corporations that said, you know what, we can do this better than the government can. And this was a time when directors of corrections were over a barrel to a certain extent. They were faced with these time-sensitive court orders to reduce prison populations. They didn't want to turn around and raise bonds to raise revenue. They didn't want to ask taxpayers for more money to build jails and prisons. And these corporations said, look, we can build them faster than you can. We can circumvent very complicated government procurement laws. And we can build these more cheaply than you can, because once we start building many of them, sort of building them on a scale versus building this one prison in one location. And that's really how these corporations got started. So 1985 was this very pivotal time. And the book asks this fundamental question, and the reason why the book really points to the mid-1980s as the pivotal time for the private prison industry is because, and this is Monday morning quarterbacking, to use a Super Bowl analogy, but it's very easy for me to stand here in 2018 and say, why didn't we have these debates about the use of prisons, the use of private prisons? Again, it was a difficult time. It was sort of the heyday of this tough on crime era. And perhaps it was because governors and directors of corrections were really under the gun to reduce prison populations or figure out how to house this additional capacity, looking down the barrel of increased prison populations. These tough conversations about why to be incarcerated just weren't had. They were very rare. And today we are living in this bipartisan era where conservatives, progressives are having these conversations about why do we incarcerate, are we sending people to prison for too long, are alternatives to incarceration better sanctions for so many people who violate the criminal code, and those conversations simply were not being had in the mid-1980s. And the book makes the argument that one reason they weren't had was because the private prison industry came in and said, we can build you this capacity. You don't have to have those conversations. You don't have to think about the physical consequences because we will do this for you. And you don't have to ask your taxpayers for additional funding. And we can circumvent these procurement laws. And so the private prison industry, in a way, let policymakers off the hook from having these tough conversations about who they should incarcerate and why. And to illustrate really how these conversations were just not being had at the time, I'm going to read you a passage from the book, and it's from the testimony of the first ever congressional hearing. So the private prison industry had its first congressional hearing in 1985. And the level of discourse at this congressional hearing is remarkable when you think about how significant it is that a private industry has come in and offered to clothe, house, care for so many people who are in prison. The occasion provided CCA with its first opportunity to testify on Capitol Hill. Richard Crane, Vice President of Legal Affairs for CCA, made the case for the government's need to save money. Yes, there are indeed con artists in this world, but if we are going to attribute that attitude to everyone, then the government better get in the business of running everything from used car lots to taco stands. So novel was the industry at the time that Kentucky Congressman Ron Mazzoli asked Crane, "What do your people wear?" Remember, this is a congressional hearing on Capitol Hill. Do they wear uniforms? Crane answered, uniforms. To which Congressman Mazzoli asked, the same uniform that would be standard? Blue trousers and so on? Crane responded, no, brown is our color. Light and dark brown. And I read that because these great questions about the delegation of governing authority, they were discussed in part at this congressional hearing, but a lot of the hearing really focused on the novelty of the private prison industry. Even the ACLU, now a thorn in the side of the private prison industry, testified at this hearing and appear relatively neutral yet cautious about this new industry and stated we need to watch them. You know, we're not really sure what this means. And that's difficult to imagine today in 2018. That questions about the color of the uniform and the trousers would be asked at this congressional hearing on Capitol Hill. That's very illustrative of the lack of significant deep debate that the country had about profit and incarceration. Now, a few years later, so this is 1985, by 1994, Corrections Corporation of America, another corporation called Wackenhut that is now the GEO Group, and other smaller corporations have really gained a foothold in managing prisons and jails. And by 1994, CCA's annual report to shareholders stated, there are powerful market forces driving our industry, and its potential has barely been touched. And I read that sentence from the annual report because it shows the commodification of the industry of mass incarceration of incarcerated people. And as I wrote that book, I tried to use phrases like shipment of inmates across state lines because I thought it was very descriptive of how incarcerated individuals have been treated since the beginning of incarceration in the United States. Here we are in this historical site at the Eastern State Penitentiary, which is the first penitentiary in the United States. Eastern State Penitentiary, and the way people were incarcerated here is actually in every criminal 101 textbook across America, because incarcerated people were spent time in their cells, almost as solitary confinement, and were not allowed to speak to other incarcerated people. And Charles Dickens visited Eastern State Penitentiary very early on. And I write about it in the book, so if you're interested, please do pick up the book and read about Charles Dickens' visits to Eastern State Penitentiary. This is really interesting. He came there looking at and comparing prison populations here and how incarcerated individuals spent their time versus in the UK. And the book examines divestment campaigns across college campuses. Specifically, Columbia University became one of the first universities in the country to fully divest from the private prison industry. Interviewed students who are leading those divestment campaigns. New York City and Philadelphia are the only two cities that have fully divested divested from the private prison industry. So the little fears I invested only a couple of months ago. And the city of Portland has divested from all corporations, not just the private prison industry, but that was part of their thinking in divesting. And the book ultimately suggests reforms to improve transparency and accountability in the private prison industry. And really at the heart of the book is comparing, what is different about spending time in a government facility versus a private prison. And I spent time in private prisons in Texas, in Colorado, in New Mexico as I was researching the book. And when you walk around these facilities, you don't necessarily know they're a private prison other than a patch that says CCA or GEO group. But the differences are pretty significant. So these corporations are not subject to open records disclosures the same way that the government is. So at the state level, in almost every state, these corporations are not required to comply with the same open records requests that the government, jails, and prisons would be required to comply with. And at the federal level, private prisons are not subject to the FOIA laws, so the Freedom of Information Act requests. And when I talk to people about this, I'm often met with shock and surprise. How have we let corporations care for so many people behind bars without ensuring that they comply with the same open records requests that the government has to? And the book finds that that's likely because this happened so quickly without this great debate. Because of the fiscal crunch, because of the tough on crime era, states were allowing these corporations to create a footprint and thrive without requiring that they comply with the same basic open records requests as their local jails or state prisons. And this isn't, the book makes the point that this isn't a huge lift, right? Jails and prisons are black boxes. We don't know a lot about what happens behind bars in jails and prisons to begin with. And when we talk about corporations managing these jails and prisons and immigration detention centers, we don't even ask. Now, at the state level, about 9% of incarcerated individuals at the state level are behind bars in a private prison. At the federal level, it's closer to 18%. And what a lot of people are simply unaware of is that most immigration detention centers are privatized. We've essentially privatized immigration detention in this country. The latest statistics indicate that more than 65% of ICE beds are in private facilities. And remember, these are places where people have not even been convicted of a crime. Most of these people in immigration detention centers, whether state, whether federal or private, are civil detainees. And I spoke to a lot of them as I was writing the book. They visited some private immigration detention facilities in South Texas. And a lot of the civil detainees there, they look and they feel like prisons. The people are not free to go, they're not at liberty to go. A lot of the individuals I saw were paid $1 a day or $3 a day to sweep floors and fold laundry. And we've outsourced most of this management to the private prison industry without requiring them to be transparent the way we ask government facilities to be. And it's been interesting. This book came out in November of last year, and I wrote it mostly while President Obama was president of the United States. I never imagined it would come out in the Trump administration. And since the book's been published, we've started to increase our reliance on the private prison industry. We've seen some additional contracts in Kentucky. We've seen private prisons break ground in Texas, and we're starting to see in the 2018 budget, the administration requested an additional $1.2 billion for new immigration detention capacity, and that's certainly going to benefit the private prison industry. So the book ultimately ends with solutions. And I want to make sure I have enough time for your questions. So the book ultimately ends with solutions. How can we improve the private person industry? And I struggled with the idea of offering solutions of reforming the industry. And as I was writing the book, I spoke to a lot of friends and advocates who cautioned me against suggesting reforms. How can you suggest reforms to an industry that's analogous to slavery? And I quote some of those people and some of their views in the book because I think it's important. And I acknowledge that even asking these questions has worrying moral ramifications. If it's a matter of, as a matter of principle, if it's wrong to profit off of incarceration, how can you suggest reforms? But in the meantime, hundreds of thousands of people are in and out of these private facilities every year, and we need to improve their conditions of confinement, transparency, accountability, if we rely on the private prison industry even for one more day. And the book recommends rewriting contracts with the private prison industry. So if I were director of corrections, I would rip up my current contracts and I would tell these corporations, you're not going to get paid unless you reduce recidivism better than we can. You know what? The government is still doing a lousy job of running jails and prisons in a lot of states. The recidivism rate is about 2/3. I think it's about 2/3 of people leaving prison will return within 3 years. And I scoured the country for any contracts that were focusing on recidivism rates and asking these corporations to do more and reduce recidivism rates more than the government. And my research led me to Australia and New Zealand, not to our own country. And in Australia and New Zealand, that innovation is starting to happen, where these corporations are incentivized to reduce recidivism more than the government can. The book makes other recommendations about improving access to these facilities. And I detail it in the book. It was incredibly hard for me to gain access to these facilities. I detailed my email exchanges, my phone calls with the private prison industry. I was met with, you need to talk to our PR person. You can only talk to our PR person. They ultimately did not provide me with access to these facilities. And in Mexico and Colorado, I was able to gain access to these prisons through the directors of corrections. So calling down, I'll show you any prison you want to see. And in Texas, I was able to gain access to these private immigration detention centers. Believe it or not, through ICE. But I tried to gain access through these corporations, and I was met with crickets. And the book recommends access to these facilities by family members, media, by academics, researchers. Really needs to be improved, and all of this can be written in the contract. And so the book ultimately makes these recommendations, but I want to leave you with something that one of the formerly incarcerated individuals I interviewed told me. Evie spent a month in a CCA-operated federal transfer center in Nevada, and she said the facility seemed different than other prisons. Wearing the Corrections Corporation of America badges, the guards looked like Verizon Wireless representatives and were friendlier than government corrections officials. We assumed this was because private prisons don't have enough staff to watch the bathrooms and walk around and check every cell. They're cutting the cost to house you, so they try to keep the population peaceful. Evie called her family and told them it was the nicest prison in which she'd ever been held. But soon the more complicated reality of the situation hit her. We realized that someone had found a way to make money off of my mistakes, my pain, my misfortune. And that right there was the biggest blow to the head. It was, oh my God, our country is so obsessed with incarcerating us when things were such bad people that they're now making money off of us being bad. What sort of hope is there for us? What hope is there for the criminal justice system getting fixed if private companies are now making money off of our incarceration? And thread emerged through all my conversations with former private prison inmates. Despite feeling a bit more at liberty in the private facilities with their MP3 players and video game consoles Everyone who spends time in private prisons believe the same thing. Private corporations that profit off incarceration are morally wrong. As Peavy put it, I'm shocked that prisons became private without a large national debate. I feel like it happened under the nose of the public. Given the immense responsibility corporations have for the safety, security, and well-being of prisoners, it is peculiar that the industry expanded with such little debate. And I want to leave time for questions, but the book also looks at the prison industrial complex and all of these corporations like JPay that provide email access and video conferencing to incarcerated individuals. I spoke to people who from Vermont who had been sent across state lines to Kentucky and Michigan to private prisons. They had to make these very difficult decisions about whether to use the money for their commissary accounts, for food, for video conferencing, or for plane tickets for family members to visit them. And a couple of the individuals I interviewed had to make a tough decision that the money was better spent in his commissary account. And so this is important because all of these corporations make it harder to de-incarcerate. We have 2.2 million people behind bars in this country. More people are incarcerated in the U.S. than any other country on the planet. You know, you're here tonight, most of you probably know the statistic. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And I think it's important to understand this profit and incarceration nexus and what that means as we continue to try to have conversations about how to de-incarcerate. And we need to look at the incentives that these corporations have to send more and more people to their prisons or their jails. We need to look at the incentives that these companies that make money off of people behind bars have to ensure that prison populations stay high. So these are many of the questions that the book raises. But thank you so much for listening to me and for coming tonight. I'd love to answer any questions you have. So the question was, is there an established cap on profit overall? And that's an excellent question. I'm glad you raised that. There is no cap on profits. These corporations can make any profit that they can. Geo Group and CoreCivic, the two largest corporations that manage prisons and jails and detention centers, the two of them combined earned about $4.5 billion in revenue in 2016. And they certainly earn a lot in revenue, but those two corporations are actually REITs, the real estate investment trusts. So what that means is that they do need to provide, they can't keep a lot of the profits. They have to put those profits back into real estate or send them to their shareholders. So there's that, the fact that they're real estate investment trusts, but they're also getting incredible tax benefit. They pay very low taxes, lower than the old corporate rate. But there is no cap. That's an excellent question. Yes.
I think there's another point too. I've had some discussions about this question. But the other nexus between profit and public policy is how much money these corporations give to them. That's a story that's not told at all. There's been a lot more movement on the mass incarceration debate, but in terms of immigration debate, I was matched up the border and members of Congress from border states and took a look at the money that they got from these corporations, find someone depending on our Congress, wonder how much that is affecting their ability to keep it in ways that seem logical.
Yeah, so the comment was about lobbying and all of these policymakers and lobbyists that are in these corporations funding policymakers across the country. Yes, and the book examines that pretty deeply. So pick up the book and read it, and at the state level, these corporations hire consultants and lobbyists in every state where they have or prisons or immigration detention centers. And at the federal level, you can look it up, and this is transparent. The federal government makes this data very accessible. You can take out your iPhone and look up all of the lobbying activity and all of the bills with the Justice is Not for Sale Act, all of the bills that members of Congress have introduced to eliminate our reliance on private prisons, improve transparency of private prisons. There's even a bill to eliminate the REIT status of these private prisons because of the tax benefits they're getting. Lobbyists have been lobbying on those bills, and it's interesting in the book when I was doing the research. On their websites, these corporations say in pretty bold language, "We do not lobby policymakers; we merely educate them." Right, so there's a fine line between lobbying and education. Yes, in the back.
Once a person is found guilty of a crime, who determines whether that person goes to a public or a private prison?
So the question is, once a person is found guilty of a crime, who determines if they go to a public and private prison? That determination is mostly made by the state Department of Corrections. Now, traditionally, we have asked corporations to partner with us to house incarcerated individuals, and we've asked them to do so more cheaply than the government can. And one way that these corporations have been able to charge the government less than what the government would spend on an equivalent jail or prison, and also turn a profit, is that these corporations traditionally negotiated their contracts for individuals who were very did not have significant mental health needs, did not have significant medical needs. For many years, these corporations were reluctant and would not take incarcerated individuals who were HIV positive. So most of the private prisons, at least at the state level, tend to have incarcerated individuals that are not seen as security risks and don't have a lot of mental health and medical needs. So that may weigh in, but this is usually a decision made by the Department of Corrections. Yes?
There had not been much formal discussion back in the 80s when this all started to happen. Is there any discussion going on? And to me, this situation is so analogous. Schools for profit and healthcare for profit. These just are things that, to my mind, people should be making money off of them, as you quote so eloquently. Is anybody talking about the nexus of those three things?
So the question is about the nexus of healthcare for profit, schools for profit, and prisons for profit. And interestingly enough, Corrections Corporation of America was started by investors who had also played a role in the founding of Hospital Corporation of America. And so CCA was modeled off of Hospital Corporation of America. And the idea was to bring privatization to prisons the way privatization was able to privatize healthcare in the country. And so they are talked about now, I think, in sort of political public policy debates. But I think prisons are different. And the book examines why prisons are different. Why is it? And there's a whole chapter on privatization, looking at the privatization of firemen, police, so many government services that are privatized. And Ronald Reagan, the private prison industry really emerged in the mid-1980s under Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan loved his blue ribbon panels, and one of his blue ribbon panels, the Grace Commission, published incredibly long, hundreds of pages of materials as its final report. And the final report recommended privatizing corrections more and more in this country. And the book examines that and why this is different, and I would submit that it is different because we're talking about people who have violated the criminal code, who are being punished, who are were deprived of their liberty. And this is, to a lot of people, this is a core governmental function. So when we talk about the privatization of prisons, it's different from privatizing other parts of our government. And part of the reason that we have privatize corrections is because corrections is so expensive. And the government just couldn't keep up with how expensive it was to build these prisons and operate these prisons. And they asked these corporations to save money and house these incarcerated individuals. But imprisonment should be expensive. You know, if we as a society have decided that someone has violated the criminal code to such an extent that they need to be removed from their communities, deprived of their liberty, you know, spend time in solitary confinement behind closed doors for years upon years, that should be incredibly expensive. We should be providing programming, and that's expensive. We should be providing education, and that's expensive. And so these are the philosophical, moral questions that were not debated enough in the 80s, and that's why the book is entitled American Dilemma, because I wanted to capture the uncertainty and the dilemma around the increasing reliance on this industry. Yes?
So privatization generally is kind of an American innovation, and you mentioned briefly there are some private prisons in Australia and New Zealand. So how does the development of private prisons here track what's going on in Western Europe or other correctional systems that are either similar or different to the way that we do it?
So the question is about how the privatization here tracks what's happening in Europe and in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. So the other countries that tend to have private prisons are the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And these corporations, Pacific and Geo Group, and there are other corporations that have a pretty significant footprint in other countries. But Pacific and Geo Group have really started to read the tea leaves that we are having serious conversations about reducing mass incarceration. 27 states have reduced incarceration and crime in the last 10 years, and they know that they may have been capped in terms of their profit if we do keep prison populations static, if we don't need to rely on the industry as much as we've needed to in the past. So they've diversified internationally, specifically New Zealand and Australia, and the prison populations are growing in those countries. Additionally, they've started to diversify into community corrections. So these corporations own a lot of drug treatment centers, a lot of mental health treatment centers, halfway houses, electronic monitoring centers. And I posed the question in the book to an academic who used to run the New York City Department of Corrections, and I said, well, you know, playing devil's advocate, why is that so bad? And if these corporations exist, wouldn't we want them running community corrections, at least the people aren't behind bars? And his answer, you know, was so on target, and he said, we need to worry about the incentives. And these corporations are for profit, and they are incentivized to make money. So do you want a nonprofit running these halfway houses, these electronic monitoring centers, or do you want companies that need a captive population, whether it's community corrections or people returning to prison, to make profit? You know, that's a really important question. Yes.
Does your book comment on, or you comment on, just sort of another side to this, which is not just do you have private prisons, but you have a lot of municipalities, a lot of state governments who are building prisons, who are making a profit off themselves by selling those beds to other jurisdictions.
Yeah, so the question was about overbuilding of prisons and selling off beds to other jurisdictions. And the book does examine that. That's sort of the theme of the book. So what happened in the 80s and the 90s was that these corporations built spec prisons. Specs are like just this real estate term. They were building these prisons, sort of, we will build it, they will come. And I profiled this town, Appleton, Minnesota. I spent time in Appleton, and I interviewed the city manager who built this prison in Appleton, Minnesota. And that's a really interesting story because they filled the prison at one point. They had incarcerated individuals from Puerto Rico come at one point because they needed to use those beds. They had people from Minnesota, Colorado, neighboring states fill those beds. Interestingly enough, they tended not to have Minnesota incarcerated individuals. the book does look at sort of the overbuilding spree of prisons, specifically private prisons in the 1990s. And looks at the lure of these prisons to small towns that rely on prisons, specifically private prisons, for economic development, and that's certainly a theme of this book. And in terms of sending incarcerated individuals to other states to fill the beds, that's what happened to this prison in Babyville, Kentucky. It was used by the private prison industry and housed with incarcerated individuals from Vermont and other states. And interestingly enough, a couple of weeks ago, Kentucky now is suffering from an increased prison population due to the opioid epidemic and some punitive laws that they've recently enacted to fight the opioid epidemic. And they signed a contract with a private prison in this part of Kentucky to house about 1,000 incarcerated individuals in Kentucky. So definitely, sending, and I use terms like shipping inmates across state lines, filling beds. In the 80s and 90s, there were people called bed brokers, and they were literally paid to figure out where there was a free bed in a prison in any state, and they had, some of them were very entrepreneurial. They had newsletters where they list, like a real estate newsletter, where they listed all of the bed space that was free. So sheriffs and directors of corrections could match up their needs with what states had extra beds. Yes.
I think that in all of this about the private prison system, that you have probably failed to indicate that the Prison Industries Enhancement Act under Lauren-Brooke, he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We also have private companies inside prisons hiring inmates, paying them a living wage, and paying toward their incarceration. I think it's a massive thing that should be discussed when you're discussing private prisons, because in reality, these people working inside the prisons can help pay for the cost of prisons and lower what we as taxpayers have to put into prison systems. And remember, prisons in the United States are the Amazon of our government. There are huge, huge amount of dollars being spent. We should be using what's going on inside the government.
So the comment was about how expensive imprisonment is in the United States and incarcerated individuals paying their way and paying for the cost of their stay. So that's not necessarily a private prison, government prison issue. Almost every state in this country has a law on the books that allows or even requires incarcerated individuals, many of them in government prisons, if they're working at all, to pay back some of their wages for their stay. That can be seen as very controversial, in fact, because a lot of these incarcerated individuals are not then spending the money on restitution and child support. But you are right that we spend $80 million a year on corrections, and in most states in this country, corrections is eating up more and more of the general fund's budget, and that's the fiscal costs are partly why we're having these conversations about incarceration. Yes.
The degree are private companies will also put money be it like food production, prison, or manufacturing of there's producing labor for cents on the dollar. Are those private companies that are also operating, albeit not at like CCA prisons and jail?
So the question is about private corporations that also have a footprint in government prisons that might be providing services. And most government prisons, you're right, have corporations providing healthcare or food services. There are some prisons where their own staff will cook the food, but most prisons do outsource something, if not many things: healthcare, food services, commissary accounts, video conferencing. And the book looks at all those corporations because they are earning money according to their for-profit corporations. And these corporations like JPay that provide the video conferencing and the email services, they're taking a cut of all of those fees. So when I email a lot of incarcerated individuals who are still behind bars when I was writing the book, I use the service JPay, and I would spend 55 cents on a stamp, and then I would include a stamp of 55 cents so they could email me back. Most of you have your iPhones. You think about how many emails you get during the day and how expensive it is for these people who are usually making a couple dollars a day, if that, in these prisons, or their families are putting money in their commissary accounts. So you're right, and the book looks at the entire prison industrial complex and improving the transparency, accountability, and looking at the incentives in a lot of these services. And I bring up JPay and a lot of sort of video conferencing because a lot of state prisons, not private prisons, but state prisons, are moving towards eliminating in-person visitation at all, and they're replacing it with video conferencing entirely. And all of the research we have about reducing recidivism and reentry and improving one's success into the community points to the need to ensure bonds with your family and your friends, and even touching them, see them. Yes.
Yeah, just
Oh, sorry. I was actually getting the one person behind you just to ask. Yeah.
Do you see outsourcing as sort of comparable to the framework you laid out for prison practice issue? For example, health services, right? That's been outsourced for a long time. Technical services that perhaps public sector could even deliver much better. Do you put that in the same category, or do you see it as all of something different?
So the question is about whether the outsourcing of corrections is a very different category from the outsourcing of other government programs and services.
Well, that are in prisons, like health, healthcare services, mental health.
And the question is about the managing of the prisons as opposed to the healthcare.
Yeah, was your storyline the same?
So it's a very similar storyline, and for those of you who are in this field or follow the corrections industry carefully, one corporation, Horizon, that provides healthcare services to people behind bars, could be at a private prison or a state prison. It's come under a lot of allegations and scrutiny, and it has settled numerous lawsuits over the years about medical care that is circumspect, if not life-altering. And in Florida, in fact, the state kicked out Horizon because of all of the issues related to medical care in that state. And recently, New Mexico canceled its contracts with Horizon because of similar lawsuits and allegations. I think the theme among all of these corporations that have a foothold in corrections is the lack of transparency, because they're corporations, they're just not subject to the same oversight. And I think we need to change the incentives in a lot of these corporations. And the book asks a lot of questions, and people have said, well, you didn't make a lot of, you ask the questions, you don't answer the questions, and that's part of what I hope this book does, is really makes people think and makes people have conversations and asks these questions and sparks an interest in this industry that has become so entrenched in corrections and immigration detention, especially now in 2018 when we have so many of these corporations profiting off of incarceration. Sure, one more question. I just want to get someone who hasn't had a chance yet. Yes.
Involving not only prisons, but their influence on legislation, civil
So so the question is about what role have these corporations played in some of this punitive legislation that has created at the center of the drive towards mass incarceration. And the book tries to make those connections as much as possible. So I'm hopeful that the reader at the end of this book is made uncomfortable about all of these connections. And one connection that's illustrative of the role that this industry has had in our trajectory towards mass incarceration is that officials from this industry were at American Legislative Exchange Council meetings where they were on the criminal justice task force that drafted Model 3 strikes legislation. And the way this American Legislative Exchange Council, how it works is that they distribute model legislation to conservative policymakers in every state. And the stats are pretty incredible. State after state tends to adopt a lot of Alex model legislation. And right there, I think that really shows the connection between the industry and some of our punitive laws, but we certainly can't blame the industry for mass incarceration. California's 3 strikes laws. We have life without parole in this country. They're in the Constitution of a lot of European countries. They don't have any. It's unconstitutional to have life without parole. It's happened to be a very punitive nation. One sort of last interesting fact: the Israeli Supreme Court actually, while a private prison was under construction in their country, ruled that private prisons are unconstitutional. So they're the only country in the world where the highest court of the land has really debated this issue at that level. So there's no private prisons in Israel.
No, please join me in thanking